Every time you glance at your phone to check the hour, schedule a meeting, or set an alarm, you are trusting a rigidly structured grid that divides the globe into precise, synchronized slices. Yet America had no standard time zones until 1883. Who decided what hour it is where you live? This is not merely a story about the evolution of clocks and timekeeping. It is a story about the raw power required to override nature, force hundreds of fiercely independent towns to surrender their local realities, and engineer a unified commercial machine out of a chaotic, sprawling continent. To understand the magnitude of this shift, you have to unlearn the fundamental premise of modern time. Before the late 19th century, time was not a universal grid imposed from above. It was a wildly subjective, intensely local phenomenon dictated entirely by the sun. High noon was not an abstract number on a schedule. High noon was the exact moment the sun reached its highest point in the sky, directly above your specific location. Because the Earth rotates continuously, the sun reaches its zenith at different moments for every point of longitude. This meant that high noon in Washington, D.C. happened a few minutes before high noon in a town just slightly to the west, and minutes after a town to the east. If you were to walk across the United States in the early 1800s, you would technically pass through thousands of distinct, localized time zones. Every city, every town, and every isolated village kept its own time. It was usually maintained by a respected local jeweler who observed the sun, or dictated by the prominent mechanical clock on the town hall or local church. When it was exactly noon in Chicago, it was 11:50 in the morning in St. Louis, 12:18 in the afternoon in Detroit, and 12:31 in Pittsburgh. Even cities separated by a relatively short distance, like New York and Philadelphia, operated on clocks that were permanently 5 minutes apart. For the vast majority of human history, this extreme localization of time did not matter in the slightest. In an agrarian society, a farmer in Ohio had absolutely no reason to care what the clock read in Boston. The speed of human interaction in commerce was strictly limited to the speed of a horse, a river barge, or a person walking. If a journey took 3 weeks, a difference of 14 minutes between the departure city and the destination was entirely irrelevant. You simply reset your pocket watch when you arrived, aligning yourself with the new, local reality. But this peaceful, localized existence was violently disrupted by the defining technology of the industrial age. The steam locomotive did not just move goods and people, it compressed space and shattered the isolation of local time. For the first time in human history, you could travel across 3 or 4 different local time zones in a single afternoon. The railroads were the first modern mega-corporations, and they immediately ran into a logistical nightmare. How do you publish a timetable for a machine traveling at 40 miles an hour across a landscape where every town insists on its own unique definition of what time it is? Initially, the railroads tried to force their own proprietary time onto the landscape. Each railroad company would adopt the local time of its headquarters or its most important terminus. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran on Philadelphia time. The New York Central ran on New York time. The Baltimore and Ohio ran on Baltimore time. But as the rail networks expanded and intersected, the result was absolute chaos. A traveler arriving at a major junction like Pittsburgh or Buffalo would step off a train and walk into a station that was a bewildering temple of conflicting realities. A single major train station might have half a dozen different clocks mounted on the wall. One clock showed the local city time. Another showed the time of the eastbound railroad line. Another showed the time of the westbound line. By the 1870s, there were over 300 local times recognized by the various railroads, and thousands more fiercely defended by the towns they connected. Passengers constantly missed connections. Freight shipments were delayed because merchants and railroad agents were fundamentally disagreeing on what time a deadline actually occurred. More terrifying than the commercial inefficiency was the human cost. Early railroads often operated on single tracks carrying trains in both directions. Engineers relied entirely on their timetables and their pocket watches to know when to pull onto a sidetrack to let an oncoming train pass. If a train operating on Chicago time and a train operating on Detroit time were sharing a track, and their engineers failed to perfectly calculate the mental mathematics of the time difference, the result was a catastrophic, high-speed, head-on collision. The mechanical beast of the Industrial Revolution demanded absolute synchronization, but the deeply ingrained tradition of local solar time violently resisted the change. The death toll from the conflicting realities of local time was not merely theoretical. In August of 1853, two trains operating on the Providence and Worcester Railroad collided head-on in Valley Falls, Rhode Island, killing 14 people. The subsequent investigation revealed a chillingly mundane cause. The conductor of one train was operating on a watch that was slightly out of sync with the other. In the wake of the tragedy, New England railroads attempted to enforce strict, uniform time standards for their own lines, requiring conductors to synchronize their watches at designated terminal clocks before every departure. But this only solved the problem internally. It did nothing to resolve the friction between competing rail networks, nor did it untangle the web of local times that passengers still live by. The first serious attempt to untangle this deadly knot did not come from a railroad baron or a politician, but from an obscure headmaster of a women's seminary in Saratoga Springs, New York. In 1870, Charles F. Dowd published a painstakingly detailed pamphlet titled A System of National Time. Dowd had spent years calculating the exact longitudinal differences between hundreds of American cities and the rail lines that served them. His proposal was revolutionary in its abstraction. He argued that the entire United States should be sliced into 4 vertical time zones, each exactly 15 degrees of longitude wide and exactly 1 hour apart. Dowd's original plan used Washington, D.C. as the primary meridian, though he later aligned it with the Greenwich meridian to match emerging international standards. Within each of these 4 massive zones, every clock would strike the hour simultaneously, regardless of where the sun actually sat in the local sky. When Dowd presented his system to railway executives, he was met with polite indifference. His proposal was mathematically elegant, but practically disastrous for the railroads. Dowd had drawn his zone boundaries using strict, straight lines of longitude. But railroad tracks did not follow abstract meridians. They followed the messy geography of river valleys, mountain passes, and economic hubs. Under Dowd's strict geographical borders, a single train line might cross a time zone boundary in the middle of a desolate prairie, miles from any station or telegraph office, forcing engineers to suddenly jump their schedules forward or backward by an hour in the middle of nowhere. Furthermore, the towns and cities of America fiercely rejected the premise of Dowd's system. Time was intimately tied to local identity and religious devotion. The concept of abandoning the true solar noon, often referred to from pulpits as God's time, in favor of an artificial time dictated by a seminary teacher and corporate executives, was viewed as an arrogant assault on the natural order. Why should a proud city like Indianapolis surrender its local reality just so a train from New York could avoid updating a printed schedule? For a decade, Dowd's visionary grid languished. The railroads continued to expand, the timetables grew thicker, and the physical danger to passengers and freight increased. The failure of Dowd's system proved a crucial lesson about the architecture of power. Mathematical logic is never enough to change a deeply entrenched system. To override the fundamental reality of how millions of people experience the world, you do not need an academic theory. You need a mechanism of enforcement. That mechanism arrived in the form of William F. Allen. Allen was not an academic. He was a former resident engineer for the Camden and Amboy Railroad and the managing editor of the Traveler's Official Railway Guide. If Dowd was the philosopher of standard time, Allen was its ruthless pragmatist. As the secretary of the General Time Convention, a powerful cartel of railroad executives formed to standardize train schedules, Allen understood precisely why Dowd's straight-line map had failed. In October of 1883, Allen stood before the General Time Convention and presented a revised map. He kept Dowd's core concept of 4 time zones, but he completely discarded the rigid geographic meridians. Instead, Allen drew the borders based on corporate reality. He pushed the dividing lines between the zones to major railroad junctions and terminal cities, places where train crews naturally changed, where telegraph infrastructure was dense, and where schedules could be easily managed. Allen's map was not a scientific division of the Earth. It was a corporate territory map, designed specifically to optimize the flow of industrial capital. Allen did not ask the federal government for permission. He did not lobby Congress to pass a law, nor did he consult the mayors of the thousands of towns his map would permanently alter. He simply asked the railroad executives in the room to agree to adopt his system on a specific, unified date. The executives, exhausted by the financial losses and logistical nightmares of the local time era, voted overwhelmingly in favor. They set the date for the greatest temporal shift in human history, Sunday, November 18th, 1883, a day that would soon be known as the Day of Two Noons. The implementation of Standard Time was, in essence, a bloodless corporate coup. In the weeks leading up to November 18th, 1883, William F. Allen orchestrated an unprecedented campaign of mass synchronization. He issued hundreds of thousands of conversion tables to railroad agents across the country. Jewelers, who had previously derived local time from their own celestial observations and local sundials, were instructed to await coordinated telegraphic signals. The United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., a federal entity, controversially agreed to facilitate this corporate initiative by transmitting a single, definitive time signal over the vast Western Union telegraph network. As the designated Sunday approached, a palpable unease settled over the nation. The press dubbed it the Day of Two Noons. In city after city, citizens gathered in public squares, staring up at the faces of prominent clock towers, waiting to see human hands rewrite the laws of nature. The physical mechanics of the shift varied depending on a town's location within its new artificial zone. In some eastern cities, the true solar noon arrived. The bells chimed, and then, minutes later, the telegraph signal triggered a second noon, the new standard time. Clock hands were physically halted, suspended in a frozen mechanical limbo, or violently pushed backward, effectively erasing minutes from existence. In Chicago, the hands of the clock on the Board of Trade building were stopped dead for exactly 9 minutes and 32 seconds. When the gears finally resumed their march, the city had been forcibly aligned with a temporal grid dictated by a cartel of railroad executives. The sheer audacity of the event sparked immediate and furious resistance. The imposition of railroad time was viewed by millions as a tyrannical overreach by the era's most hated corporate monopolies. Religious leaders denounced the shift from their pulpits, arguing that the sun, moon, and stars were the only legitimate arbiters of time, established by divine decree. To subordinate the natural rhythms of the earth to the arbitrary schedules of a steam engine was not just unnatural, it was fundamentally profane. Local governments actively fought the transition, triggering bizarre jurisdictional battles over reality itself. The mayor of Bangor, Maine, famously vetoed a city council resolution that would have adopted Eastern Standard Time, declaring that no one had the authority to change one of the immutable laws of God. For months, Bangor operated in a fractured reality. The railroads ran on the new standard time, while the city's churches, schools, and local businesses stubbornly clung to their local solar time, which was 25 minutes ahead. Similar temporal civil wars played out in Detroit, Cincinnati, and countless smaller municipalities across the frontier. Even the federal government of the United States found itself completely outmaneuvered by the railroads. The United States Attorney General officially declared that no government department had the authority to adopt the new railroad time until Congress passed a law explicitly authorizing the change. Therefore, federal courts, post offices, and government agencies were legally bound to continue operating on local solar time, even as the trains outside their windows ran on Allen's corporate grid. But the railroads held a power that superseded local ordinances and federal decrees. They controlled the physical arteries of commerce. If a town refused to adopt standard time, its factories could not reliably coordinate freight shipments with the rest of the country. Its merchants could not guarantee delivery dates. Its citizens risked missing the trains that carried the mail, their relatives, and their economic livelihoods. The resistance was passionate, but it was structurally doomed. The industrial machine did not have to lobby for a federal law to enforce its will. It simply had to make compliance the only economically viable option for survival. Slowly, begrudgingly, the holdouts surrendered. Jewelers reset their display clocks to match the daily telegraph signals. Factory whistles began blowing according to the railroad schedules, forcing the working class to align their waking hours with the corporate grid. The local timekeepers, the men who had once looked to the sun to tell their communities what hour it was, were rendered entirely obsolete, replaced by a copper wire transmitting a synchronized pulse from a distant observatory. For 35 years following the Day of Two Noons, the United States operated in a profound legal gray area. Standard time was the de facto reality for almost every American, dictated by the overwhelming economic gravity of the railroad monopolies. Yet it lacked any formal statutory authority from the federal government. The final catalyst for the legal codification of time was not a desire for domestic harmony, but the urgent mobilization for total war. In 1918, as the United States entered the mechanized slaughter of World War I, the federal government required absolute synchronized control over the nation's industrial output, coal production, and transportation networks. The time for local resistance and jurisdictional disputes had ended. Congress finally passed the Standard Time Act of 1918. This sweeping legislation accomplished two monumental shifts in the architecture of American power. First, it legally validated the time zone system engineered by William F. Allen and his corporate cartel, officially transferring the authority to define and adjust time zone boundaries from railroad executives to a federal regulatory body, the Interstate Commerce Commission. The government simply absorbed the corporate grid and stamped it with federal law. Second, the act introduced an entirely new, even more aggressive manipulation of reality: daylight saving time. Designed to artificially extend evening daylight to conserve coal for the war effort, this provision proved that if corporations could successfully override the sun to schedule trains, the state could mandate the mass manipulation of clocks to fuel a war machine. The consequences of this temporal revolution permanently rewired the human experience. The definitive victors were the architects of industrial capitalism. By successfully severing time from the natural, localized movement of the sun, they transformed it into a standardized, interchangeable, and universal commodity. Abstracting time from nature laid the essential foundation for the modern hourly wage, the synchronized 9-to-5 workday, and the frictionless global supply chains that define our current era. The losers were the local communities and their intimate connection to the natural world. Human beings ceased to be creatures governed by the solar cycle and became instead subjects of the mechanical clock. The deeply rooted autonomy of towns and villages was dissolved into vast, homogenized blocks of time, stripping away a fundamental layer of local identity. Today, the responsibility for managing this grid rests with the United States Department of Transportation. If you look closely at a modern time zone map, you will see that the borders are still not the clean, straight meridians that Charles F. Dowd originally proposed. The lines snake erratically around specific counties, violently split states in half, and carve out highly specific economic zones. These jagged borders are the living legacy of the same political lobbying, corporate maneuvering, and regional economic tensions that define the original map of 1883. The precise grid displayed on your smartphone is not an immutable law of physics or a natural feature of the Earth. It is the lingering ghost of a 19th century corporate coup, successfully executed by railroad barons who understood that ultimate power is the ability to define reality for everyone else. As you navigate the rigid schedules of modern life, it forces a profound reckoning. Do you believe the immense economic efficiency and technological progress of this synchronized grid was worth the permanent severance from the natural, localized rhythms of the Earth? To continue uncovering the hidden historical architecture that dictates the modern systems you interact with every day, subscribe to the channel.